The title for the session is The Politics of Growth. We are very honored to have Dr. Hossain Zillur Rahman, Executive Chairman, Power and Participation Research Center, as the chair for the session. We have Dr. Ashikur Rahman, Senior Economist, Policy Research Institute, and Dr. Kaji Ali Tawfiq, Research Director, Bangladesh Institute of Development Studies, as the discussants of this session. I would like to request Dr. Hossain Zillur Rahman to start the session. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. So we get started on this session. This is the Politics of Growth. That's the title of the session, and we have 3 papers. The first one lays out an analytical framework for understanding the politics of growth. And then we have 2 country studies, one on Bangladesh and one on India. And following these 3 papers, we'll have 2 designated discussants, and then we have time for some open discussion. Now, the opening paper, Deals and Development, the Political Dynamics of Growth Episodes. This will be given by Professor Sabyasachi Kaur, Institute of Economic Growth, India. And in terms of time management, each of the paper presenters gets about 20 minutes, but the Bangladesh paper has agreed to sacrifice some minutes for the opening presenter. So we stick to the time available, and the 2 discussants will have about 8 to 10 minutes each. Thank you. Professor Sabyasachi Kaur.
So this is going to be a presentation of the framework that will be used by the 2 studies subsequently. We have a lot of things in our framework, but due to the paucity of time, what I'm going to present are the basic nuts and bolts of our model. And we are hoping that during the discussion, we'll be able to actually answer a lot more of your questions, if any, on the framework. So let's start by thinking about what is it that we are trying to explain. When we say growth, what aspect of growth do we need to explain? There was a very interesting question 2 days back here, that growth is ultimately a small number. I mean, why do we need to look at growth? So what we are trying to explain is not growth per se. Growth is actually an indicator of what's happening overall to the economy. So if I take, for example, the economy of Jordan, which you can see here, over time you can see there have been periods of output going up and output going down. And clearly, the economy was in a different fundamental state in each of these episodes, if I can call them episodes. And what the growth rate does then is basically give an indicator. It's an indicator of what's happening with the health of the economy. So it is basically not about growth. It is about growth episodes, where each episode is distinct from the other. Mostly, each episode will either be a growth acceleration or it will be a growth slowdown. So you could have the Bangladeshi economy growing at 2%, and then suddenly in a particular period, it goes up to 5 or 7%. So what we are trying to explain is why did it start growing at 5 or 7% compared to the 2% earlier? So we are talking about much more fundamental things than just the rates of growth here. So what do we use to explain these episodes? And where does politics fit in? Our basic understanding is that in order to have a political economy analysis of growth, you have to relate politics to growth. Now, if you ask any economist, I mean, what is the role of politics with growth? They will tell you why. The politicians are ultimately the policymakers, and so what they do in terms of policies have an impact on growth. But these actually leave out 2 important questions. First of all, what is the incentive of the politicians in particularly undertaking certain policies? Why do they do what they do? That's not answered in this kind of analysis. So what we're going to do is, we are going to look at what incentives politicians also have in the growth process. And in order to do that, we have taken into account various aspects of the economy, including the political space, the institutional space, and also what we call the rent space. The rent space, let me get to each of them in some detail later on. But these are the important aspects of our framework. And what the framework does is it shows how the political space and the rent space and also sometimes economic ideology interact with each other, and that determines the institutional space. And by the institutional space, I mean mainly in terms of growth, it's mainly the property rights institutions. So how the property rights institutions get impacted, and hence how that leads to growth accelerations or growth slowdowns. So that's basically our framework. So let's start with the institutional space. Now, we all know that in first world countries and in institutional economics, we think of institutions, good institutions in terms of good rules of law, good property rights institutions, and good government institutions. But we all know that in developing countries, these are not the same as in developed countries. There are very important ways in which developing country institutions are very different from those in developed countries. This graph taken from Pritchett and Worker's work, which has come out in Economics, Journal of Economics Survey, makes this point very clearly. So here, what they have done is, they have looked at two different surveys of the World Bank. One is the Doing Business Survey, and the other is Enterprise Survey. Now, the Doing Business Survey gives you, in terms of days, how many days it takes, for example, to get construction permits for a company. So here we are talking about the institutional space, we are talking about property rights, we are talking about ease of doing business. And in the enterprise survey, the companies actually tell you how many days they need to get these permits. And what they find is, across a large number of countries, two things. Number one, there's absolutely no relationship between the actual number of days that they need and the days that the rules say they actually need. So what they show is basically that the reality of institutions in third world countries particularly is not defined very well by the rules. So what then is substituting for the rules? And here what we characterize these as deals as opposed to rules. And I'll come to a little more explanation of what deals are. The next thing that they have done throws a little bit of light on what deals are. So here, for the same set of countries, they have divided it into various quantiles. So you have the top 90th quantile, the 75th quantile, 25th quantile, etc. And what you see is the upper left-hand corner is for the countries or the firms that get the permits the fastest, so that they're the most efficient in terms of the institutions. You see that there is absolutely no relationship between the rules and the deal. But as you come to the countries and the firms that are worse off, that are less efficient, there seems to be some relationship between the rules and the deals. So what basically this shows is that it's not that everybody gets the same treatment from the governments. What you see here is that the government gives certain companies or certain, in some countries, they give better treatment to some businesses than to others. So property rights are a variable in these countries. And so basically, this is what we define as deals. Now the word deal basically in English means an exchange. So what is the exchange here? What we think is that basically, since in these countries, the formal institutions are not in a place to provide property rights, etc., these rights are provided or guaranteed by some political elite who has the political power to ensure those rights. And in exchange, obviously, the political elite who needs for their own political, carrying out their political activities, they need resources. There is an exchange from the businesses, and that is exactly what the deal is. So that is why some businesses get a better deal, while other businesses don't. So we have a characterization of this deal space. So what we differentiate between what are open deals as opposed to closed deals, and ordered versus disordered deals. So open deals are when a lot of businesses can get the same deal from the political elite, whereas closed deals are where only a few people get the deals. And then, ordered and disordered is basically when the deals are guaranteed, there's a high guarantee of the deals, it's a very ordered deal. But if the businesses are not very sure that in future the deals will be there, then it becomes disordered. It will be clear later on why these characterizations are important for our framework. Next, we go to the political space. Now here, although we define it as a political settlement, I don't want to get into the debate of what a settlement is. Let me show you what is important from our framework, for our framework. For our framework, what is important is how the political power is distributed in the country. So you can have power distributed in two ways. We call it horizontal distribution and vertical distribution. So where the political elite has to share power with opponents, it's what is called, that's horizontal distribution. So the opposition has a big role to play in the political space as well. As opposed to this, we have the vertical distribution. What is the vertical distribution? This is where the political elite, in a single party maybe, have to distribute the power with lower parts of the party or the grassroots of the party, so that they don't have the the veto right to decide on things. So this is this is the difference between the horizontal and the vertical distribution. And corresponding to this, you can characterize the situation as one with a strong dominant party, or a vulnerable authoritarian coalition, or a weak dominant party, or what is importantly called competitive clientelism. So this is the characterization of the political space in our framework. Finally, we have what is called the rent space. Now, what is rent here? We've talked about rent in economics for hundreds of years, and it's been defined in different ways. But for our purposes, just think of it as supernormal profit. Not in the normal sense. You can have supernormal profit in a business simply because your business is very entrepreneurial. But suppose you are making supernormal profit because of some inputs from the government. The government gives you cheap land. The government gives you certain licenses. So it is because of inputs from the the political elite that you are making supernormal profit. That is the part that we call rent. And so basically what we characterize, so this in a way, our production space, just as we characterize them in terms of agricultural sector, industrial sector, tertiary sector, we have characterized it differently. We have characterized them in terms of whether the rent is high or the rent is low, and also whether they're in the export sector versus whether they're in the domestic sector. So to just give certain names to these business elites, we call those in the export sector which earn high rent as rentiers. So if you can think of the African countries who have lots of minerals, large number, high amount of rent is made out of that. So they are exporting that, and so they are rentiers basically. As opposed to that, you have magicians who are highly competitive and in the export sector, and then you have power brokers who are working mainly in the domestic markets, and still they make a lot of rent. They have a lot of rent. And finally, you have the workhorse sectors, which are basically the most traditional sectors that are competing within your domestic sector, etc. So these are the four sectors that we characterize in our production space. Here is how we actually look at a diagrammatic representation of the rent space. So here you have magicians, workhorses, rentiers, power brokers, etc. in the four parts of the diagram. The top is magician, the bottom is rentier. On the left you have power brokers, and the right you have workhorses. And this is just an example that I have taken from the Indian case study to show that over time this is what has changed. And we claim that these changes have an important role to play in our framework. So you see here that there was in the 1960s, there were hardly any magicians, and the size of the power brokers was also relatively small. But what has happened over time in India is that there's been a significant magician sector as well as a very large power broker sector, whereas the workhorse sector has actually shrunk over time. So this is how we characterize the rent space. So finally, how much time do I have? 5 minutes. Yeah. So finally, let me just put all of this together. So how does the political space, the rent space, the deal space, all of this explain what we want to explain, which are growth episodes? So basically, if you remember what I said in the beginning, we are either explaining why growth accelerations take place, or we are explaining why growth slowdowns take place. So let's look at growth accelerations. And this is a schematic presentation of what we think happens, which leads to these growth accelerations. So if I don't have a pointer here, but if I can just go over, let's just start with the political settlement, the rent space, and the ideology. aim is that if an interaction of all these aspects, if that leads to one of the three boxes that you see there in the institutional space, if the interaction between these leads from a disordered to a closed ordered deals world, or from a disordered to an open ordered deals world, or from a closed to an open ordered deals world, then all of these kinds of changes in the institutional space leads to growth accelerations. This is basically how our, the three, four aspects of our framework come together to provide growth acceleration. We also have what is called feedback effects. What that means is that, the effect is not linear only from these spaces to the growth acceleration. The nature of the growth itself also has feedback effects on these spaces. So you have on the top something going back, and it's called the feedback loop from growth. Feedback loops from growth affect both political settlements and the rent space. And then finally, we have external factors, global factors also sometimes affecting the rent space, and sometimes they affect the ideology of the country as well. And hence, all of these lead to growth accelerations. Next, we come to slowdowns. So this is very similar, except that in the institutional space, when the interactions lead to either an open ordered deals world becomes closed, or from ordered it becomes disordered, or if there was a closed ordered and that persists over time, these are the kind of changes that leads to growth slowdowns. So basically, that's fine. I'm almost finished now. So here you have a schematic presentation of how growth slowdowns take place using our space. Exactly how these things interact will be much more clearer when we actually make some of the country studies. You will see some of these connections in those country studies. So just before I finish, there are two feedback loops that we want to specify here. One is a political feedback loop, and the other is an economic feedback loop. The political feedback loops work basically when the nature of the growth is such that it leads to political changes. It could be positive or a negative feedback loop. If the nature of the growth is such that the political changes lead to sustaining of that growth process, then it's a positive feedback loop. But if it challenges that growth process, that kind of a political feedback loop is a negative feedback loop. You can also have economic feedback loops, which again the case studies will make clear. So finally, let me just say that this is our basic framework. And we are going to here present two case studies, one Bangladesh and India, which I hope will make this framework a little more clearer. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sabyasachi. Would you just take 30 seconds to explain why you chose the word magicians as one of those four categories?
Well, I think that in these countries, there are such hurdles to competitive firms being able to be competitive. I think they are magicians.
They're getting solutions despite hurdles.
Yes, they're being successful as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sabyasachi. So next, we bring in the Bangladesh case study, Dr. Mirza Hassan.
So I'll be talking mostly about politics, and my co-author Selim Raihan will take care of the economics. Bangladesh, I mean, these are known facts, so I don't want to...
Mirza, just to aware, so both of you are sharing this 20 minutes.
Yeah, he will come. Yes, he will come. So Bangladesh, achievements, we all know those. Per capita income has risen, poverty cut down, and so on. And Bangladesh is a good country compared to other South Asian countries, except India, I think. So how is that possible? What are the constraints? And given the uncertainties in the global era, what's going to happen to Bangladesh? So these are the stuff that we're going to talk about. Bangladesh has also been considered as a development paradox. The term was coined by around 2010 by the World Bank. And basically, what they say, that Bangladesh, bad governance, weak governance, no rule of law, and so on. But how did they manage this growth rate? 6.5 plus, in average. And because the assumption is that you need property rights that Sabyasachi was talking about, credible commitment on the part of the state, efficient enforcement of contracts, and so on. But how did Bangladesh manage? So this is a paradox. It's a black box for them, and they left it right there, okay? and without explaining the black box or opening up the black box. We'll try to do that a bit. We'll try through the political economic conditions that allowed the steady growth in Bangladesh, and we'll try to unpack the conceptual black box and the growth paradox. And we are questioning whether at all this is a development paradox or not. And then the economics, I invite Selim, Raihan.
Thank you. This paper is a kind of example of a collaboration between an economist and a political scientist. Actually, what we really wanted to do, and I think it's very nicely being described by Professor Sabyasachi Kaur. So based on the framework, actually we applied this, how do you define growth breaks when you look at the data of a very long time series data. So these are the growth breaks for Bangladesh, and we started from 1972 to 2010, and GDP per capita, and we found that using sophisticated econometric procedure like biparent test, and we also added some filters, we found there are two breaks in 1980, one in 1982, another is 1996, and then these two breaks actually give us three different growth episodes. I really want to have the kind of discussion whether we disagree with these kind of breaks, whether we think there are certain characteristics of these growth episodes, but this has actually come from very solid econometric statistical procedure, as well as looking at how the growth in one period or episode is very statistically different from other period. Now, just to give you a bit of idea about the pattern of structural change, I think the Bangladeshis who are present here, they have a very clear idea about that. The composition of GDP, the agriculture is declining, industry, the way one expected, probably did not increase to that extent, the share, and the share of service sector actually also increased. In terms of openness of the economy, the country has moved from actually aid dependency to more of trade integrated economy in terms of both export GDP ratio and import GDP ratio. But the phenomenal growth of the ready-made garments exports, that is something which actually differentiates Bangladesh from many, many other countries. But I'd like to draw your kind attention to the last figure, which is the economic complexity index. Actually, we tried to relate this whole political economy analysis with the kind of products, the kind of what Hossain and Hidalgo said, the product space. What kind of products these countries produce, and whether these are a kind of consistent with the structural transformation which happened in that country. So idea is that the kind of rent space or political settlement of the deal space, which actually Sabyasachi, the framework he was presenting, and Mirza Hassan, he will talk about this in details, whether they're also kind of consistent with the kind of products Bangladesh produces. So you will see that over time, the economic complexity actually is declining. It is in a very simple term, it shows that the Bangladesh is over time is not producing complex products. The type of products Bangladesh produces can be produced by many other countries. So here is the kind of economic complexity in a very, very simpler term, is that despite the kind of structural transformation we have seen in the country, in terms of in the product space, we have not seen much improvement. That is also kind of reflected in our export basket, and we know this story, but again, the last growth episode shows that a heavily concentration of the green part, which is nothing but the ready-made garments. Sabyasachi talked about this framework, high rent, competitive, and export-oriented on the domestic market. These rentiers, we did not find any true rentiers in Bangladesh based on the natural resources. But there are magicians like ready-made garments and other exported industries, power brokers like many of them in the services sectors, and workhorses. But one thing we'd like to kind of argue that, despite we don't have a true rentiers, but our political elites, they've probably found some of these magicians as a source of securing rents. So even if the ready-made garments in this framework may appear to be competitive and low rent, but actually, there are many sources of rents even, to extract from the ready-made garments. So, and then we also try to understand what are the shares of these power brokers, magicians, workhorses, and rentiers. And we found that the main message which comes out that over the years, the shares of the magicians has increased, as well as the power brokers, which are actually high rent in the domestic market. That, yes, Mr. Bhai, please.
That's covered. I'm going to skip that. As you can see, Sabyasachi Kaur has covered those things, so I'm going to skip that, but I'm going to use that. Back to political reality. Well, what we are saying that instead of market enhancing governance, which helps market to grow, capitalist economy to grow, which is the World Bank's assumption of what good governance is, we are using growth enhancing governance, which somehow helps the economy to grow by whatever means. It doesn't have to be rule bound, it can be deals oriented and so on, informalities and so on. But informality is kind of bounded by by the shadow of, under the shadow of law, basically. Anyway, so in that, how we had this very robust form of growth enhancing governance. This growth enhancing governance is characterized by de facto rent sharing. Rent has been described. For the non-economist, it's just privilege. Some people get privileges. But interestingly, although we have zero-sum game in politics, but in economics, predominantly, the rents are being shared across political divide. That's one of the magic of Bangladesh growth. And Bangladeshi political elites have the capacity, have the incentive to separate the economic rents from the political rents based on contingent needs. Sometimes they will give access, little access to opposition people or whatever, and sometimes they will not. They will allow efficient sector to grow. And another very important thing is a largely ordered deals environment. Despite being open, closed, semi-closed in various sectors of the economy, closed would be power sector, open would be RMG, but it is largely ordered deals, okay? We never had seriously any disordered deals, period, except probably 1972 to 1974, that period. One example I can give of a classic disordered deal is the Korean EPZ. You remember the 20 years of all this drama that went with that particular project. So these are exception in Bangladesh. And all these, these ordered deals, de facto ordered deals, provided the de facto credible commitment. The business, the market actors could trust in the long run the politicians, their incentives, their motivation. And that also gave them the transactional certainty, which is very important for market actors to operate. I don't need to go into that, but the point here is that in Bangladesh, over the period that we have covered, the limited access order, did you cover limited access order? Not at all. Anyway, this is, what we have is a limited access order, basically. Not everyone gets access. It is based on political calculation and so on. But in politics, we had pendulum shifts. We have authoritarianism, then democracy, then going back in between. And you won't know in Bangladesh, I'm sure you're familiar with our pendulum shifts, regressing and progressing in politics. But when it comes to economics, what you had is a continuous maturation process, despite the regime type, despite the political management. In the economic domain, I call it paradigmatic change, shifts. It continuously goes in the better direction, more or less. And these things, ordered deal, the paradigmatic shift in the economy, these all provide the political settlement that helped the ordered deal to survive over time. And it provides, the lengthening the market actors' time horizon for realizing return to investment, and the preserving the process of growth, enhancing economic governance throughout the time. And interestingly, economists largely argue that you need a competitive, credible elections and so on. When you have that, then the time horizon of the market actors may not be conducive for them. And that's why people who argue in favor of authoritarian management in politics, they argue that you have a longer time horizon because there's a predictability. This regime is not going to change in the next 5 years. So that in Bangladesh, despite, irrespective of authoritarianism or democracy, this time horizon for the investors continued. Okay, so this is something unique about Bangladesh. I'm moving fast. We can discuss that during the discussion. And how did ordered deals survive? Ideology matter. Political elites are convinced about the market ideology, preference for market-led growth. Developmental legitimacy was valued because of lack of legitimacy in terms of electoral legitimacy. So they're largely relied on the developmental legitimacy. And this all provide predictability and stability. And over time, business community also became politically powerful and is manifested in the regulatory capture, increasing dominance over the party, parliament, electoral political process. And that helped also the order deal to survive, okay? And they also bought the state service when needed to shorten the transaction time. In a perverse way, this is again contra market enhancing governance or good governance. Largely corrupt, non-meritocratic, kleptocratic bureaucracy helped the business class. You can buy them if necessary, okay? And that also helped. And also business class to deal with the political bickering between the two parties, they developed opportunistic alliances syndicate to secure order deals. So business people with different political partisan identity, they create syndicates at the district level, at the national level, to survive if there is any threat from the zero-sum game of the politics. But the concern remains, will Bangladesh continue with this kind of ordered deals, with the deals at all, when you're talking about further growth rate, when you're talking about structural transformation or maintaining higher growth rates? So that's the concern that remains, whether because we have moved recently, post-14, from a competitive politics to more what we call dominant party politics. One party calls the shot now, like Malaysia, like Singapore. And I would finish as a political scientist here. To me, is this concern a valid concern? Think of China. They're with no property rights defined in a liberal sense. They have moved for the last 30, 40 years, progressing. Okay? There are many countries, Singapore, many countries, they didn't need good governance as such. And let me finish with an anecdote. Some people have heard it the other day, so please forgive me for this. There was a debate between Francis Fukuyama and Acemoglu and Robinson, their famous book on why nation fails. They were saying China is growing fine, but at the end of the day, their political economy will have to conform to the liberal discourse of good governance, with property rights and everything. Otherwise, China will fail. So Fukuyama asked in a debate, fine, 30 years China has been growing. Should we wait another 90 years for your theory to prove right? Thank you.
Thank you, Mirza Hassan. We now have the second case study on India by Professor Sabyasachi.
So this is based on a paper that I've been writing with Professor Kunal of Manchester and Jagdish Sahu. And this basically uses the framework that I've described earlier. So let's start with, like Selim described the Bangladesh case. Here we start with the Indian case, and we look at the time horizon of Indian, sorry? Yeah. So here we see that using the same techniques that Selim had talked about earlier, we actually get two breaks in India, one in 1993, the other in 2002. And we further argue that in 2010, we have another break, which unfortunately, because we do not have sufficient data till date, we cannot use a technique to prove that it is a break. But based on other proof that we have, we argue that this is also another break in growth episodes in India. So given that there are 4 episodes, we actually have got 3 transitions, but I'm going to just focus on 2 transitions because they'll be sufficient to explain our framework. So the first transition is one in 1993, where there was a growth acceleration. And then we have another transition in 2010, where we have a growth slowdown. So I'll be using the framework to explain why we think that we had an acceleration in 93 and why in 2010 we had a slowdown. So the first case is the growth acceleration of 1991. Now, in the literature, of course, there's been a lot of analysis of this, which basically says that there was the adoption of reforms, market-friendly reforms, and this led to the growth. But we think that together with that, there is a very large amount of analysis that's not been brought into the literature, and we are trying to do that in this paper. So just to look at the economic outcome, to understand what was happening. So India's per capita income grew from, on an average, 1.85% in the first episode, that is from 50 to 92, to 4. It grew in the second episode. Let's see, where is it? Yeah, it 4.15%. This is the last line in the second episode. So there was a very significant increase in growth rates between those two periods. Although in between there have been changes in growth rates, decadal growth rates, etc. But we never had a significant growth break because those growth rate increases were not sufficiently high enough. So we have this very significant growth acceleration between 91, before 91 and after 91. So let's go back to our framework. We look at the political space and the rent space during these episodes to see if we can explain this growth acceleration. Now here, I've put in a table which actually gives a lot of information of the way the politics was changing. We focus on two aspects of the political space: the competition. You remember the framework had horizontal and vertical, sharing of power. So here we have political competition, and we also have ideology. So, instead of going through all of them independently, what I'll do is I'll just sum them up in this slide. So what we had during this period is that initially there was a dominant party, which was the Indian National Congress, which ruled India from independence to 1989, except for a brief period after the emergency. But over time, the dominance of this party has gradually eroded. And so basically, in terms of political competition has increased in India over time during this period. So there was clear evolution of India's political system from this dominant party. Towards the end of this episode, there were minority governments, which is in a way very different kind of political, competitive political system that we found during this period. Secondly, in terms of ideology also, we find that from the 1950s right up to 80s, there was ideologically a very pro-socialist kind of approach during this period. And this was something that was there not only in India, this was there in almost all of South Asia, and in fact there in a large number of other countries in the world as well. And this is in a way the way the global thinking affects political thinking as well. However, 1980 onwards, what was found is that the socialist ideology was increasingly being sacrificed due to political compulsions of the Congress party, which was starting to face increased political competition. Next, we go to the rent space. So, compare between 1960 and 1980, roughly, the beginning of the first episode and the end of the first episode, you see that the main difference that has come up was that the share of the power brokers have gone up. So basically, what was happening is that there was a small class of these, large entrepreneurs like Ambani's, Birlas, etc., that were over this period slightly starting to become this high rent kind of, sector in the economy. So that was the change in the rent space during this period. So given the, the rent space and the politics, how do we explain the growth acceleration? So let me take you through these slides, which will try to explain that. So in spite of the dominance of the Congress party during the early part of the episode, the deal space was disordered. And this is very surprising because, as Mirza was saying, usually you expect that a dominant party would provide ordered deals. And this is where the difference between political interest and political ideology comes in. So what we argue is that the disorder was mainly because the ideology was actually pro-socialism. It was not pro-growth or pro-business. And so there was very little interest actually in the government to provide a good state-business relationship during this period. So in fact, we give three reasons for this disorder. First of all, the pro-socialism economic ideology during this period. The second was because the Congress party was actually a dominant party during this time, it did not need to turn to the business class for any resources. So in fact, it had no interest in having a good relationship with the business class during this period. So that was also one of the reasons why the deals were not ordered. And also the the amount of rent-thick industries was such a small part of India at that time, it was not also a sustainable thing for them to do. They wouldn't get enough rent out of the system because there were not simply enough, industries, rent-thick industries during that time. So not surprisingly, the disordered deals during this period resulted in low private investment and growth during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. However, from the 80s onwards, things started changing. Political competition, rent space, deal space, growth, all of these things started changing. So following the first non-Congress government in 77, Indira Gandhi realized that the complete dominance of the Congress party was almost over. And needing new allies and resources, and by the way, all that I'm saying here is taken from literature also, it's backed up by other literature. So needing new allies, for resourcing, fighting elections, she needed resources as well. She started supporting the alliance between the political and the economic elites. And hence state-business relations started getting more collaborative and ordered. And the Indian state clearly signaled to the big domestic capitalists its intention to credibly commit to these strong pro-growth policies. So these led to closed deals. But remember, Indira Gandhi was not actually interested in growth. She was interested in resources for her party. So she did not think of very open deals as a result. All that she was interested in are a few big companies that would be able to provide her with the resources. So it was a very closed deals kind of world that she created during that time. So although it led to a very ordered deals world, but the industrial base was so small that it did not lead to very large increase in growth during this period. Then we have the 90s. So in the 90s, what happened is the political space continued to be competitive with the Congress. There was one Congress government and in fact 3 non-Congress governments. So it was becoming more and more competitive. But there's another very important thing that took place during this period in the political space. And this is the change in political ideology of, or rather economic ideology of the political elites during this period. There was a very strong way in which, cutting across political parties, the belief in market systems, the belief in pro-market reforms, started permeating, we would argue that this did not happen, overnight. It's not that from the pro-socialist ideology, just one day they became pro-market. It was the pro-business period during the 80s that actually allowed them to rethink the whole, process of growth. And it was that led to this change in ideology also. Of course, it also helped that globally the thinking was changing. So this is another global effect of on the political system. So this led to adoption of economic liberalization in 1993. Now, you can question, so liberalization, everybody says liberalization led to growth. So what's the big deal? The issue is, we think that while liberalization obviously led to growth through the rules-based market, they also made a huge difference to the deals world in India. And how is that?
Professor Kaur, 5 minutes.
Okay, so then I'll have to, okay, let me just take my time to finish this case only. I won't go to case 2 then. So how is that? So the thing is that, there were 2 particularly important rules that were changed during the reforms. The first is the industrial licensing rule, and the other was the import licensing rule. Now, what was happening is that when you had the industrial licensing and import licensing rule, you had this whole plethora of small bureaucrats who were, who had been given the power actually to work out small deals at the local level for businessmen. And so this led to a very strong and entrenched deals world, not at the top, but at the bottom. This is similar to what was being talked about in Bangladesh with the police thana, etc. also. So the thing is that when there was a change in the rule from licensing to no licensing, it also did away with the deals world completely. The ability of these bureaucrats to actually work out these deals with the small businessmen was not there anymore. The businessmen did not need any more deals. So it had a profound effect on the deals world as well. So if you look at actual data, these 2 reforms, the industrial licensing reform and the import licensing reform, which really led to a lot of increase in investment and growth in India during this period. And this is what we argue is basically underlying the growth acceleration. I don't have much time. Okay, so quickly I'll go to case 2, which is the slowdown. So again, just quickly, what happened is we had a third growth episode. We had an even higher growth rate, which was more than 6%. And then after 2010, suddenly growth rate started slowing down. And we need an explanation of why that happened. So again, if you look at the political space, an important change that had taken place during this period is that from a minority government, we went into what are called alliances. So alliances are these big parties which also go along with a number of small parties. So basically what it says in terms of the vertical sharing of power, the parties become much weaker, the big party become much weaker. And a lot of these deals are now actually in the hands of the smaller parties. So this is what happened in the political space during this period. And you see the rent space also, an interesting thing happened. We have simultaneous increase in both magicians as well as power brokers. So what happened is, following the reforms, there was a very large open deals framework that led to a lot of magicians like the IT sector, etc., coming in. But parallelly, you also had the rent-thick sectors which started coming in the third episode. So that included the telecommunications ministry, the telecommunications sector, the real estate sector, the mining sector. So basically, we had a two-track economy. We had one efficient economy as well as one rent-thick economy, both growing, and that's what led to the very high growth rate in the third episode. But what happened is that together with what I described in the political space, where the power of the party, the top party decreased significantly, it became a weak dominant party. So a weak dominant party with a lot of possibility of deals led to the possibility of crony capitalism. Because now, the lower parties, the regional parties, they do not have access to resources in a formal way as the bigger parties do. So they are actually prone to much more of using the deals for transfer of resources than the bigger parties. So as a result, what was happening is while growth was taking place, it was also opening up opportunities to these smaller parties to strike out deals with these, in these sectors, and that led to a lot of scams, etc., during running up from 2007, 8, 9, 10, etc. And then we argued that what happened was there's a negative feedback. If you remember my first scheme, we talked about a feedback loop and political and economic feedback loop. And here what we have in India is there was a negative feedback loop. So once the deals and the scams were became open through the media, there was a pushback from the court system, the judiciary. There was a pushback from various social groups. There were organizations that, there was an anti-corruption movement. So all of this, what they did is basically they challenged the political settlement and led to from ordered deals to a very disordered deals. The bureaucrats were being hauled to court. So they did not want to take any more decisions about the licenses, etc. So what you had is a system where the bureaucracy was almost stopped working. So basically from a very ordered deals world that we had before that, we suddenly plunged into a disordered deals world. And that's what led to the low growth and the low investment and growth slowdown. So with that, I'll just just conclude by saying that the two growth transitions discussed highlight the value of our growth framework. Both examples are good arguments of analyzing growth, not in terms of long-term averages, but in terms of episodes. The first case describes, how the combination of changes of politics and economic ideology leads to growth accelerations. The second case highlights how political feedback effects can quickly lead to disorderliness, and this can lead to growth slowdowns. So this actually underlines the importance of understanding the politics underlying growth processes. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kaur. I hope all of you took that in. A lot of analytical sort of insights there. We have two discussants, and I want to invite first Dr. Ashikur Rahman, Senior Economist at the Policy Research Institute. About 10 minutes.
Thank you. I have been to many political economy analysis, and as an economist and somebody who takes a lot of interest in politics, I have to thank Mirza bhai. He never made politicians look any better than what he did today in Bangladesh. I remember an old story, if I am allowed to say, that Ayub Khan was once asked or informed by somebody that Field Marshal General Osmani bought 2 dogs. And Ayub Khan asked, so what? And he named them one Field, the other one Marshal. And he said, thank God, at least he did not name them Ayub and Khan. So today, by calling politicians credible deal maker, I'm happy he did not call us credible thieves or just thieves. So that at least that bit of clarity is there. No, I am thankful for inviting me here. So I want to go to the literature where this deal-making framework is trying to, or at least attempting to incorporate. So I read the introduction chapter with quite interest. And the Acemoglu-Robinson, I think it won't be completely right to say that the Acemoglu-Robinson framework did not try to explain growth episodes. I think if you take the two conclusions of the Acemoglu-Robinson framework, it says that inclusive political institution leads to inclusive economic institution, and that creates a good, stable state where you get sustained economic progress. The other conclusion of the Acemoglu-Robinson framework is extractive political institution leads to extractive economic institutions, which leads to growth, which can lead to growth, but it won't be sustained. That's what the Acemoglu. So he is saying that extractive political institutions and with extractive economic institutions can lead to growth, but it won't be sustained. So he is giving some insights on episodes. And he brings up a theory of critical juncture to explain why you can move from inclusive institutions to extractive institutions. So I agree with Mirza Bhai that there's two unexplained gaps in Acemoglu's analysis. One is the case of Japan, which nobody talks about, which achieved industrial state under an extractive political institution before the World War II. People keep talking about Singapore, people keep talking about China, but the real counterexample is Japan. Singapore and China also shows that you can achieve an industrial state or last growth for 40 years without developing inclusive political institutions. So that bit is the missing element where Acemoglu's doctrine is challenged. The other unexplained puzzle with Acemoglu and Robinson, which Professor Ronak Jahan touched marginally yesterday, is how can there be extractive economic institutions under inclusive political institutions? And that's a puzzle. So let me give you a stat. Currently, 0.1% of United States own 90% of US wealth. US had 100 years of democracy. It's considered an inclusive political institution. And yet such profound degree of economic wealth concentration happened. Many would say that it is somehow failed to tame the pulse that creates extractive economic institution. India, we know through many social indicators, has failed to address deprivation such as sanitation, immunization, which China has achieved. And currently, 1% of India, there is a report that owns 60% of its wealth. Again, a case of whether extractive economic institution can emerge within inclusive political institutions. So I think there was a need for a theoretical framework that offers a nuanced micro-political analysis of drivers of growth and also of distribution. And I think this deals framework tried to address that to some extent. I think the elephant in the room is policies. We know, as an economist, we know from the economic framework that certain policies promote unstable growth, such as expansionary monetary policy. We know that expansionary monetary policy will produce growth for a while until the economy heats up and it will grow back. On the other hand, certain policies we know from the economic framework will produce sustained growth, such as supply-side reform. Now the question is, are there political dynamics that makes it more likely to choose one policy over the other? Now the deal framework looks at the drivers within the range space and its interaction with the political context driven by the political settlement and the ideology of the actors to explain these choice of policies. It's an interesting attempt. I'm not completely convinced as a reader. I think the deal's environment's weakness is when Douglas North said outcomes are determined by the rules of the game, he meant rules of the game and not formal rules of the game. By rules of the game, it meant informal institutions and formal institutions. Now, informal institutions have two. Developing countries are not primarily driven by formal institutions. It's primarily driven by informal institutions. So informal institutions have two primary pillars. One is the institutions of reciprocity, which this deal is trying to pick up, and the other is of patronage. So I felt that the deal terminology is trying to kind of rebrand what informal institutions can achieve under different political context. The second thing is, why do growth collapse? We are talking ultimately about episodes, right? So, and another issue that needs to be understood, and which Olken and Jones showed in their leadership paper, I think it was in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, that leaders have an effect on growth. Their choice of policies have effect on growth. Three things can affect growth episodes if you push that extension. One is, if leaders supports growth supporting policies under a stable plural regime that is dependent on election, with a state that has capacity, under that framework, growth can collapse if election leads to a dramatic change in policy. So that is a way where growth can collapse under that framework. The other one is, if growth is supported by leaders, growth supporting policies are supported by leaders, under a stable, non-plural authoritarian regime with some state capacity, in such cases, growth can collapse if a changing authoritarian leader results in a change in policy, and that typically happens in personality-based dictatorships, not party-based dictatorships such as China or Vietnam or others. So there is that nuances. So the way I would say this is, if you see, if you go back a bit and see Reagan and Thatcher, the way they came and the way they shaped the policy space, the way Deng Xiaoping came and the way they introduced a lot of policy space with their own ideology, I do believe that ideology has a role, might be the primary driver of that residual. And I will finish by saying that I think what we are trying to explain is a very difficult animal, which is the residuals of growth. And economics is, for me, or politics, is more art than science for us to truly understand these volatilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ashikur Rahman, for extending the framework of analysis for the open discussion which will follow. Now we have Dr. Qazi Ali Tawfiq from the Bangladesh Institute of Development Studies.
Okay, I enjoyed reading both papers. I will first comment on the framework, and then I will go to individual country studies. Well, the framework is explained in many different ways, which is interesting. But I can interpret, or I try to understand it in a very simple way, which is been partly covered by the previous commentator. This kind of framework assumes that, there should be competition. Deals or contracts have to be enforced. This is neoclassical economics in terms of the role of contracts in growth. Now, in economics, we read, formal sector looks at the contracts. Obviously, Acemoglu, Douglas North, and others, they also emphasize informal rules, but the implicit idea is you make a transition from informal to formal rules. So when contracts are enforced, then people invest. It's not only enforcement, it's also inclusive. You should have competition for innovation and things like that. So this is done in, mainstream economics through formal rules. They will also appreciate the role of informal rules. So now the first premise of this approach, or many approach in this variety of thought, is formal rules don't work in developing countries. Of course they don't. In Bangladesh, if you have formal rules, you don't have to worry about somebody coming from the other side of the road. So people don't enforce those rules. But then how they do get enforced? So the whole framework will explain any political configurations, they use the term political settlement, that can generate what they call ordered contracts and more open contracts will have almost very similar solution as formal sector or formal institutions dominating the rule. So if you look at, if you go through the papers, both India paper and Bangladesh paper, they have divided the growth paths into different years, and the growth paths, the upward sloping growth paths are categorized by largely ordered deals, sometimes closed, sometimes open, but ordered deals is very important, which means that a negotiation is enforced. Now, how is that enforced? If you read this paper, it is mentioned that, you know, it's ideology of the elite plays a big role. I mean, if you want to explain the Congress rule, when you have the licensed Raj, they had a kind of socialist economy in mind. Whereas 72, 75, well, it was a war-torn economy. I don't know whether it is appropriate to put it in a normal development phase, a la the Indira Gandhi Congress period, and characterized as a negative growth. It was a war-torn economy. Whatever that time was, is characterized by, you know, looking for ways to develop. So you had some kind of uncertainty regarding deals. Okay, the reason I say that is, so you make tremendous compromise in terms of level of abstraction. You go from the higher level of abstraction as done in economics, and then in Asimoglu and Dog North, and then you explain growth by informal institutions. And when you do that, I use the term robust, but then you can really explain each and everything. You are not making propositions, you're not making hypotheses, you are taking a period, you look at what happened in that period, and within that framework, you fit in, and then you explain that thing. You don't say, if I have higher incidence of, say, magician sector, lower incidence of this, then what is the outcome? This kind of statement you don't get, because I hope one day your framework reach such a level so that you can predict. But as a first start, I think it's a very nice way of explaining things. Like Mirza's paper, as I said, I'm very critical of this approach. At the same time, I like this approach. It just makes me feel good. I can explain a lot of things. Like Mirza's paper will explain why Bangladesh had, whether you agree or not, had tremendous growth rate despite having poor performance, governance performance. You would say Bangladesh government during the growth period was able to maintain relatively ordered deals. You know, these ordered deals can come from the wisdom of the rulers or the elite group or their concerns, whatever, but they made an ordered deal, which means that informal rules were supplying some of the formal rules characteristics. You know, so that is the core of this framework. I mean, they put it in rent format or political settlement format. This is fine. These are frills. The essence is any informal institution, if that can mimic formal institutions as close as possible, you get better growth outcomes. In Bangladesh stage, as Mirza has shown in some stages, it was able to mimic formal institutions. I say that because I thought it will make my arguments clear. Okay, so now, but as I said, the compromise that they make is the level of abstraction. So they can't talk about inclusive growth. They talk about growth. They can't say anything about corruption, because to them, growth enhancing contracts are better. If a political leader makes an contract with an economic elite, and this transaction leads to some kind of corruption, that will not be analyzed. That will not be valued as good or bad. The outcome that it led to investment is the key criteria. Okay, so let me go to some general comments which is valid for Bangladesh and India. Little minute. Okay. Okay.
Colleague of BIDS, so I have to again.
Okay. Okay, open deal, exactly. Now I go to the nitty-gritty of the papers. I really don't like the graph which talks about economic complexity. It's misleading. I was talking with the authors. I'm like, in early 80s, Bangladesh was exporting jute and jute products, and our complexity was high. And now we are exporting RMG, and our complexity is low. So this I find when you compare with other countries, they will have a very different view about it. So you might try, as I was saying, different indicator like global production networks, this kind of indices, and see whether that explains better the complexity aspect or structural adjustment aspect of the deal outcome. So this something I don't like. The paper, obviously, as a growth paper, talks about growth rate, doesn't talk about investment thing. I mean, this issue came up in BRAC on Thursday, on the first part of the day, where we can't explain the current high growth GDP rate and the investment, private sector investment is declining both in Bangladesh and also in India. So if you take, I'm repeating that, that's an important point. This, if you have more ordered deals and if it is more open, you should have investment growing. This is not happening either in India or in Bangladesh. So this is something might twist your framework a bit to explain this. I find the standardization of rent space, I understand it well, deal space, but when it comes to political settlement, I see the two papers using it differently. The Bangladesh paper is more eclectic, deals with limited access order of Douglas North. The Indian paper is well within Rustak Khan's framework. So when you compare the 10 country studies, some kind of standardization may be required so that you come with general statements. And the analysis of feedback loops when the economy makes a transition from one equilibrium to another, you address to other factors rather than things within the model. That is fine, but I think that has not gotten adequate treatment. How an economy make a transition from one growth rate to another growth rate. As I understand, that can be due to a host lot of other external factors. Okay, I think the Bangladesh paper comment and the India paper comment, I'll pass it to the authors. It's very stylistic what they did, so it's not important for this occasion. I'll pass it. I'll send you an email, specific comments on those part. The final comment that I want to make is, the one thing I found common both in Indian and Bangladeshi experience, which is in both countries, the share of workhouse sector declined, the magicians increased, and the power brokers gone up in both the countries. It would be good to understand why I see this pattern. This pattern is not generated by formal rules. This pattern is generated by informal rules, by the deal space, very different, the political space, very different two countries, but the outcome is same. You have same outcome by two political configurations. Maybe some explanation would be useful to know why it happened. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Khalid Tawfiq. So we had these three papers and two discussions. Lots of issues have been, I think, for the open discussion to reflect on. You have, of course, a lot of new analytical ways of looking at these issues. You have choice of indices is also an issue as it came out. You have the reading of the evidence. Has that been an issue itself? And of course, at the end, the larger issue which motivated these papers, the interface of politics and economics, that remains as an issue you can comment on beyond the papers themselves. So it's open for the floor, and start with Professor S.R. Usmani.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We had some very stimulating papers, opening very different methodological avenue for investigating growth experiences. Lots of food for thought. I want to make one comment about the Bangladeshi study, but I also want to make a number of methodological points about the approach in general. If I'm going on for too long, Mr. Chairman, please stop me, and I can come back later.
Again, a former colleague, I'm constrained.
You see, in the Bangladesh case study, you're making the argument, if you're following the approach, what you are suggesting is that the growth acceleration in 1996 happened because the deal space and the rent space improved. That would be the implication of your following the framework. But that begs the question, why did the deal space and the rent space improve around that period? What was the underlying political changes before that period that led to those I did not find that analysis. I did find the some analysis of the kind in the Indian case study, because the Indian case study did go into the analysis of the political competition, changes in political ideologies, which, according to this analysis, led to changes in the deal space, and then in turn to the growth performance. What I've seen here is an argument that there was an improvement in, implicitly you argued that there was an improvement in the deal space, and therefore growth episode improved. However, there was no analysis of why that deal space improved. We need to fill that gap. Now, regarding the approach as a whole, it's an interesting approach, but I think as a constructive suggestions to the people who are following this approach, I want to make the following observations. First, see, when your growth episodes happen to be short periods, in the Indian case, for example, one of the growth period episode is only three years long. But between your second and the third, what's the gap between the two? Okay. Is there any particular reason why you take this 8 years? You see, the reason I made the point is, if you one problem with the growth episode approach would be, you are trying to explain the growth episode in structural terms. Whereas if the growth episode is short, relatively short, then what's happening here may not be structural changes, but macroeconomic changes in terms of changes in aggregate demand. So you may be capturing business cycle fluctuations rather than structural changes. So in order to follow your approach, you need to actually cancel out any effect of business cycle fluctuations. In other words, the methodological what is appropriate would be, when you are dividing up the period into different episodes, you should be working on not actual growth rates or actual output, but what macroeconomists still call potential output, because the potential output will trend out the business cycle fluctuations. And then you can do your structural analysis on that. That's methodological suggestion number one. And number two is your recognition that there can be feedback, reverse feedback loop is extremely important, and it needs to be taken into account. But it's not just need to be taken into account as a possibility. I feel that for your approach to be credible, there needs to be some kind of assessment of the relative quantitative strength of the direct causation versus the reverse loop. Because if the reverse loop is the dominant force which creates the correlation between deal space and the growth space, then your explanatory framework loses explanatory power. For your framework to have explanatory power, you have to demonstrate that the reverse loop is a minor force. Otherwise, you are not really explaining growth episode in terms of deal space and rent space. The final methodological point I want to submit is, even if we accept a framework as a theoretical tool, and accept that, yes, changes in deal space and rent space can cause changes in growth performance, I think it is still a very big jump to go from deal space and rent space to growth performance. How do we know that this is these deals that actually led to those growth performance? One way of being more confident about it is to go through an intermediate stage of standard growth accounting. If your growth episodes have changed, if the growths have accelerated and decelerated, then according to growth accounting framework, something must have happened in either of two things, either in the factor accumulation part or total factor productivity part. Without these two, growth episodes cannot change. Growth performance cannot change. It's an accounting reality. So if you can then show that of these two components, factor accumulation and factor productivity, if you can then analytically show that the deal spaces that you have identified, changes in deal identified, have either impacted on the factor accumulation in an identifiable way, or impacted on the factor productivity in an identified way, then your claim that it is the changes in deal space and rent space that has affected the growth performance would be much more credible. Otherwise, there's a big black box between the deal space and growth performance. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Osmani. Sir, আপনি বলতে চেয়েছিলেন কিছু? আপনি কিছু বলতে চেয়েছিলেন, স্যার? Okay, all right.
Thank you to all, especially the presenters and the discussions. Only my humble suggestion is that in each field, especially in politics of growth, I think we need more action research. One of the, just to give one example, as in the morning I was talking about the Smilings and Clinks work, because it is working now 20,000 villages. One of the study I found that we call the community service provider, CSP, girl, SAC, education, all village who provides health services. I found in last local government elections, 90% of them elected as female member of Union Parishads. And that's surprised because they have education, they have direct contact, and they earn money because they are employed, and they also 50% share they get the selling of the. I will ask that if we could go more with action research, more and more things will come out. Thank you.
Thank you. There at the back.
I have some just query to Mr. Sabyasachi for his nice presentation. You have said that the Indian economy, the irony of capitalism, leads to political corruption and political rent seeking. Okay, and on the question of Bangladesh, if all the other things remaining the same, but lot of growth indicators, we see that Bangladesh is growing up, is positive. My question is this: through your vast experience of study on political economy, what kind of institutional reforms are needed in countries like Bangladesh, do you think, for economic growth? Or what is the more imperative prescription? That means the rules of the game, you need either informal institutions or formal institutions are essential for growth inclusiveness. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, there is one at the end.
Just to kind of trying to understand, take a little bit more structure. So it seems like the exercise is trying to endogenously identify some trend break and trying to understand what happens to those political outcomes before and after those trend break. So if that's kind of a right or at least simplified way of looking at what you're doing, it seems like that exercise can be taken to any other countries and trying to see if there's a similar stuff take place there. So one like humble suggestion, like I think great way to look at that thing is to look at India at the state level. If their state level economic growth rates are available, so perhaps it's maybe a kind of a very easy way to see, for example, if there's any predictive power into the model, as Dr. Tawfiq has suggested. And also, I think in the Bangladesh case, I really agree that we didn't really get what kind of changes really took place around 1982 and around 1996. We know politically what kind of regime change it took place, but what actually happened, which led to change in economic growth. So I was wondering, using state as a laboratory, Indian state as a laboratory to try to understand, have a better understanding of whether those trend break really make sense in the dimension that you're actually looking at.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm Krishna from IEG, Institute of Health Economics from Dhaka University. My first question was to Selim Raihan sir and Qazi Ali Tawfiq sir as well. You were talking about the complex goods and simple goods that in the past we used to produce those simple complex goods, but now we are producing simple goods. So what is the reason behind that? I'd like to know that. And second question is for Sabyasachi sir. So you were talking about these alliance of different small parties that were leading to reduction in economic growth. So do you want to say that as the weak part, as the dominant party is becoming weak, so why it is becoming weak? And are you trying to say that the alliance actually leads to the reduction of the economic growth? Is that the thing? And to Ashikur Rahman sir, actually, you were telling about the Japan's growth. It's actually unexplained. So I'd like to know further about this. So thank you, sir.
Thank you. और क्यों नहीं सर तेरे अपनी process on.
When Usmani is around, I don't think you then need to invest too much time in pursuing the conceptual debate, because he does it with such precision that I think everything else after that becomes kind of redundant. So I will make some more simplistic observations. Now, number one is, of course, using terms and explaining phenomenon. And I'm a bit puzzled by this because there is a tendency for both academic economists and political scientists to actually substitute their own definitions of the English language. And so when you actually redefine what is commonly understood in the language with your own definition, then of course that becomes an open access order, because then you can go on playing this game and introducing whatever definition you like. Now, why I use this analogy is that my simplistic understanding in the English language over settlement and political settlements would be that there is some sort of common understanding amongst the political players along with the business community in terms of how policies should be carried out and how they should be actually enforced, right? Now, if you actually look at the trajectories of the growth episodes that you have identified, and you then relate it to the degrees of settlement, I would basically say that in interpreting the sort of Bangladesh environment, you may have had a considerable degree of settlement in the Irshad regime of the 80s when the political parties were essentially weak. This then, of course, naturally became a bit more divisive after the 1991 election. And in each successive election episode and the transfer of power, political settlements tended to become progressively weakened until down to today, when we are having our highest rates of growth, there is virtually no settlement whatsoever. So in those circumstances, the trajectories of growth and relation to my understanding of the term settlement as a person who just understands a little bit of English, is that in fact actually there is a opposite correlation at work over here which needs some sort of explanation. Now the other problem with this also is that the analytical framework doesn't really take into account specific events which may have impacted on the growth process, and also specific institutional and political arrangements. Now, obviously, to begin your episode and predicate it on 72 to 75, really does not tell you anything at all about the objective conditions which were prevailing between 72 and 75, where if you had any growth at all, it was something of a miracle, because obviously you had war-devastated economy, you had a major global economic crisis associated with the energy boom. You had famine. You had, in fact, the suspension of lending processes at particular moments of time. All were, in fact, actually exogenous factors which were really influencing the growth process. So you have to obviously disaggregate this particular process. Now, if you move from our part of the world, say to a country like China, obviously the whole admixture of relationship between, say, the business community and the state or the political players takes on a completely different complexion, because in the China-Vietnam model, and even if you go back to that, to the India of the Nehruvian period, you had a much stronger proactive state, so that the admixture of working out deals and understanding was also determined by the strength and depth of the state. And that if, in fact, the main drivers of growth at that particular time was not the sort of settlements or deals you actually had as between these two players, but where, in fact, say, the state may have been a dominant player, that was an important factor in driving growth processes or in having a negative impact on growth. Now, in the Chinese case, the highest periods of growth, when you were really running double-digit growth rates, were really in the first decade and a half, say from post-Deng Xiaoping period, going on up to more or less the mid-90s. The state was far and away the main driver of growth, and they were sustaining very high rates of growth, where you needed to look at both the institutions, the policies, and the operational capability of the state to see what was really driving growth at that moment of time. Now, at a later episode, when in fact you have now got a huge and very dynamic private sector, the state still remains a major player in driving this. And of course, actually, they have a very close understanding with the so-called private sector in China, so that they can, in fact, really regulate their behavior and, in fact, back this up when, in fact, specific problems are, in fact, afflicting the private sector. You are seeing, for example, this whole problem about global surpluses in the steel sector, where on the one hand, they are subsidizing the steel industry. On the other hand, they are closing down factories. But the initiatives are not being done through the market mechanism. The initiatives are really being done through the direct intervention of the state. So the relative play of the state becomes a very critical variable in this, which you have to take into account. So at the end of the day, I mean, if you are basically predicating the outcomes of this process on some sort of so-called settlement theory leading to a sort of deals world, you have to be very clear in your mind that what exactly is the settlement and who exactly are making what sort of deals. And this will become a very central element in the interpretation of what conclusions you have to sustain a robust theory. Now, if at the end of the day, all that you do is you describe a series of episodes, and you then ascribe then various explanations for why that particular episode happened, that's fine. You can describe any such episode as you like. But if you are wanting to put it in the framework of a holistic theoretical definition, then I think you do have serious problems and you need to go back to the drawing board. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll come back to the presenters now. Professor Sabyasachi, you don't need to really answer all of them, but choose the ones that you want to.
Okay, thank you. I think I'll go in reverse order, starting with Professor Shubhan's comments. I won't comment on the Bangladesh part. My colleagues will do that. But I think on one level, I agree that this framework has an underlying assumption, and that is we are looking at private sector-led growth, and the state plays the role of enabling private sector, and growth happens through that channel. But as you suggested, in China and in Nehruvian India, the growth process itself was not a private sector-led growth. In fact, there was a very strong public sector-led growth approach. In fact, even before Indira Gandhi's pro-socialism, I would say there was a very strong pro-growth period during initial Nehru years, which sometimes gets overlooked. But we have public sectors now as well. In India, till date, public sectors are far larger than private sectors. And so it is a challenge for this framework of how to deal with public sectors, because they're not directly having to strike deals with the government. And we have worked out certain ways of thinking about it. As we have made it clear, it's a work in progress, so your suggestions we'll take into account, and we're working on it. But there's one way of thinking about it which I think makes it again consistent with our framework. And this goes back to Pranab Bardhan's hypothesis about why growth was low in our first episode, the episode that I've talked about in India. Pranab Bardhan was perhaps the father of political economy in India. And he suggested that since the public sector was actually the driver of growth, what the political elites were doing, together with other elites in the economy, there were the large landlords, big landlords and other elites, they were siphoning resources through the public sector. So instead of the deals story that you have for the private sector, you can have an equivalent story, where the public sector policies like pricing policies, employment policies, even investment policies can be used by the political elites and other elites to siphon, resources to other sector. And so again, what will happen is, depending on the deal that the political elite work out with other elites, you can have either a pro-growth or a non-pro-growth regime. So if all the resources that were there in the public sector were channelized back to investment, India would probably have very high growth rates back then also. But instead of that, it was used up to satisfy the other political players. And hence, you had a kind of a deal that led to lower growth. I think something like that analysis by Bardhan can be relevant even in today's world, where you have both private and public sectors simultaneously in the economy. And so I think we can think of how the political elite also have deals with the public sector in that sense. So that's just a partial answer to your question. Let me go to the other questions, and wherever I can answer. I think a lady asked me, why are parties becoming, large parties becoming weak, and do smaller parties mean low growth? Yeah, I think there are two things happening here. First of all, more competition in political space, I think, is good, especially in a very large country where there are all kinds of groups. Their interests have to be protected, and in many situations, one or two parties cannot do that. The problem is not with the number of parties. The problem is what is happening because of the competition in politics to how the institutions are being built up and how money is being siphoned off. So in order to answer one of the other questions, this is related, what is the reform that we need? In India right now, a big reform that is being talked about is election funding. If at least, I'm not saying that election is the only expenditure of political parties, but it is a large expenditure of political parties. And so if we can actually think of processes through which they do not have to depend on the business, I mean, obviously, even then the funding will have to come from the business class, but it happens through transparent mechanisms. Then maybe some of these deals do not have to be worked out the way they have been worked, at least for the smaller parties. The larger parties are exempt from all of this. But smaller parties who are, they're constrained by funds and have to run to business and have a deal with them, may not need that deal anymore. So that may be the kind of reforms we are thinking about here. I agree, we are starting state level analysis, so it's ongoing work. I think many of the suggestions are well taken, and we are already thinking about them. So I can't take care of all of them individually. Lastly, I just want to talk about two things which the discussants have talked about, and I think they have actually made our framework clearer to the people. But I have one or two small disagreements with them, which I would like to put forward. So while I agree that Asimoglu have touched upon or indicated things about episode, I think what is really missing in that framework is this whole negative feedback loop or the positive feedback loop thing. Because while he does talk about these corrections, they do not actually clarify how these corrections will actually take place. And we think that some of these feedback loops are very important in these correction processes that happen, and as a result episodes take place. And where I slightly disagree with my friend here is that I think he tried to characterize deals as another way of temporarily providing rules. And I think the difference between deals and rules is that while that's true that it provides local temporary rules, there is also the other aspect which is absent in rules, which is that there is no quid pro quo back to the political system in rules. You don't have to pay back anybody anything in a rule. And that makes a huge difference to efficient use of resources. So when you have deals, there's a lot of resources that are being inefficiently used because of the deal, and that's where I think the deal is very significantly different from a rule-based world. Thank you.
Thank you. Mirza, do you have?
I didn't get any specific.
Okay. Don't need to answer if you don't.
I will try one or two which I think is more political. I agree with Ashiko. I mean, deals at the end of the day is reciprocity and patronage combined. The difference would be you are talking about equally powerful actors in deals, which is not true for patron clientelism. Okay, that would be a difference. And in this framework, I think the editors are also trying to deal with the question of role of leadership, ideology, state capacity, and so on. And our paper also touched on that. And I said in a very perverse way, in Bangladesh, bureaucrat state capacity has been made better by making deals. Since you can buy them, you can make them more efficient. Okay, the state capacity is coming to the back door in that sense, more informally. And war-torn country, Professor Rahman Subhan, also Qazi Ali Tawfiq, they also mentioned. Sure, I mean, that period, we termed it as a disordered period with no ideological question. He said it was in a flux and a lot of problem. It was a case of disordered deals. And I think Selim will talk about that. There was a negative growth rate at the time. So that kinds of relate to that. Other than that, I think I'm done, more or less.
Selim?
No, very quickly. No, but I must thank the comments and from the audience and as well as the discussions. These are very useful. Two or three just responses. One on the product space, I fully agree with you that that concept is still not very solid because even when Hossain and Hidalgo, they use this product, develop this product space, they use especially the export data, not even the national accounts data. So when you talk about complexity or the economic complexity is actually looking at the export data and then try to understand what are the products countries are producing. So when you see the declining trend, actually Bangladesh is always negative. It's not Bangladesh was always on positive in the 1970s and 80s and declined to a negative. So yes, so that's there. That means that even in that, using that index, that country is not really producing that kind of complex export products. Second point is that the deals and rent, how does it really, how they're related to growth accounting. I fully agree with you, sir, Professor Osmani, that we need to actually link it with a concrete evidence in more econometric way. We need actually micro level data, the farm level data. Actually, probably that is something we are looking for in the next step. But when we are writing this paper, we didn't have any kind of data like this. So what we had to do, we kind of used a kind of a qualitative survey of some representative sectors and also representative firms and try to understand how the deals environment and rents environment work in those sectors. Actually, we surveyed 12 sectors and various firms within these sectors, starting from ready-made garments, power sector, banking, and other sectors. And in the growth acceleration, The periods are, actually the breaks are in 1982 and 1996. Between 1972 and 82 and 83 and 96 and 96 onwards. It may appear to be kind of like, what really happened in 1982. We know there was a kind of, we can relate it to very clearly the political change. And also in 1996, maybe the democratic transition actually happened before that. But I would say that what we actually observed is looking at the data, there was a kind of lag effect in some of these cases. So in some of these cases, those breaks may have a bit of 2 years or 1 year forward and backward effect. And we tried to actually then understand how this rent and deals environment changed over time during this growth acceleration, during these 3 phases. Thank you.
Ashik, there was a question on Japan, I think, if you take it.
I think to understand Japan, we also have to understand US a bit. The story of US economic miracle, some people think, the founding father of economic growth of US is Alexander Hamilton, who created the federal state, who created the Navy, who created the tax structure, and who promoted export as policies. He created the state that we know it. The similarity of Japan is it also had a strong state. Irrespective of the fact that one had a democracy, the other had an imperial state, both had a strong state that gave public goods. I think that is where, as Professor Rahman mentioned, a lot of the early growths that we saw in many countries are a product of a state that responded with public goods. So that's my small understanding of the growth process. Thank you.
Thank you. Tawfiq?
30 seconds. I think the answer regarding this complexity is now clear, so I'm not going to address that. I don't think deals are very different from contracts. Deals are nested in contracts. For example, the deal is, economic elite coming to the political elite saying that reduce the interest rate, I will invest. That's the deal. But it is nested in contracts because they have to have a deal with the bank. They have to borrow from the bank. So you can't really talk about deals without going to contracts. I'm talking about deal, which is either reciprocity or whatever in realization process. You have to go through normal contracts to market. That you can't avoid.
Thank you.
At family level, possibly you can.
Thank you. Sorry.
Your problem is, if you define RMG as a single identification of complexity, so that the rising share of RMG as a single category in the export economy will indicate that there is a decline in complexity, but actually the RMG of the 80s and the RMG of 2017 are not the same. In fact, there are a huge amount of backward linkage going on into this sector, and there are about 10 different industries which have really emerged to, in fact, actually service the RMG sector. So if you redefine the conceptualization of what is actually an industry, and you define complexity as diversifying industrial entity or industrial process, then I would think you would get somewhat different results in terms of your complexity curve.
Thank you.
5 seconds to respond to. Yes, contracts can be reproduced. It's not a one-shot game. Deals is a one-shot game.
Okay. We have an opportunity in the tea break to continue this, but I want to thank the presenters and also the discussants. I think let's give them a big show of hands. There has been the comments, etc., clearly showing that this issue of the interface of politics and economics is a very important, interesting issue to deal with. And there is a very honest and innovative attempt to try and address this issue. But having said that, I think the Usmani Bhai and Professor Soban, they have really pointed out the challenges ahead in terms of really convincing a wider constituency, both the academic constituency and those who actually deal with the policy-making world in terms of the value of these sort of approaches. And I am a bit struck about the reference framework from to which these sort of academic initiatives are really drawing their initial impetus from. I mean, you partially mentioned that your focus is on private sector-led growth, where the state is an enabler. These sort of conceptualization are, this liberal economic order, that's the reference point. Now, obviously, there are limits already inherent if that's the reference point on which you are trying to build analytical frameworks. The interplay of the state, the economy, and society, these are, ongoing processes. And in 2017, I think with the consolidation of China as a major power and many other countries around the world beginning to see the Chinese way of doing things, strong state but market-friendly, capacity, and many governance qualities beyond the election part of it. Those sort of models are now becoming attractive to Vietnam, to Iran, to many other countries that compared to this liberal economic order. So I think as we are developing these frameworks, it is important that our analytical framework stands the test of transcending the reference from which we began to really try and address this. In the Bangladesh context, again, and you see the World Bank, the donor presence at the back of the room seems a very important one here, because they brought into being the market paradigm in the 80s because Africa was failing, African development wasn't taking on. Then when the market paradigm was not answering in the 90s, the governance paradigm was brought forth. And now, I don't want to say that now, obviously, that's not it, but I see a potential here to be wrong-footed by. For example, how accurate, the Mirza and both Selim and Mirza, in a way, have referred to the development paradox as a legitimizing reference point to explain why they are explaining these things via political settlement. How accurate is the development paradox as a framework which will stand the test of time? We are talking of growth happened despite poor governance. Think of the 90s, identified as poor governance. But poor governance by indicators a la the World Bank's 6 indicators. But if you look at 90s, it was the decade in which serious banking reforms took place in Bangladesh. It was the decade when serious infrastructural reforms took place via the rural road revolution of Bangladesh. It was the decade in which telecommunication reforms took place, by which mobile now has become a universal thing. It was the decade in which local governance reforms took place, by which women entered into the local government, and the reality of union parishads became a much bigger role. Shall we describe, certainly via some of the indicators of the World Bank, 90s could be seen as poor governance but growth. But if I do not adhere necessarily to that framework, I see that no, there were many governance progress during the 90s, which could explain some of the growth achievements. So development paradox, I would appeal, let's put it to rest for a while and not be constrained to really invest our creative energy just to find out why governance happened and why governance poor growth happened or not. Because I think it is important to unpack governance itself not beyond the framework, the good governance agenda. And Mushtaq, my friend Mushtaq, obviously has been very active promoter of this. But when you say, the market enhancing reforms to growth enhancing reforms, there is an implicit assumption this is a choice. You have one is not working, let's choose the other. Growth enhancing reforms is not necessarily a choice in the sense of bureaucrat signing off an order. It's a political achievement, actually, because it means reforming the state. It means transforming the way bureaucrats think about. It means how the state-society interface really works. It's a political achievement. It's not a policy choice, actually. But in the way I see the way you have tried to pose this here, it is almost seen as a choice, and therefore, this didn't work, let's choose that one. In fact, most frequent refrain in seminars like this, not the political seminars, others, Bangladesh has good policies, implementation is the main problem. Why do you say that? Because adoption of policy doesn't translate necessarily to outcomes. And implementation is the problem. It's not like let's choose another bureaucrat. It is about reforming that institutional space. So I think these are sort of issues which have to be taken on board if attempts like this are to really produce useful concepts by which we can both understand society better, by which policymakers can also take cue and really take it forward. I would conclude on the point that the interface of politics and economics is a crucial subject, and more than ever, at the end of, in this period of turbulence, we were talking of, ordered, I think the other day, it was pointed out how even that, you mentioned election funding as an issue. It's a bigger issue in USA, actually, which is one of the most developed countries in the world. Election corruption is a bigger issue in USA in a different form. There, the elites, faceless money bags, are owning the people who are getting elected and ordering them to carry out these policies. As you see, the person in the White House, while he is keeping us busy with his antics, his cohorts in the Congress are passing one law after another, which is rolling back everything in favor of big business who have no interest of the society at large. So I think the interface of politics and economics is a vital space, and it's very good that economists are getting involved, but I decided to do my PhD not in economics, partly because economists have a sort of a hidden imperialistic attitude about conquering other disciplines. Douglas North got the Nobel Prize, but is the recognized reference point for understanding institutional processes, and likewise. So I think the political space economists needs to get in to understand this space, but there are, I think, the challenge of understanding that space has, many unanswered realities which we need to take on. So I think it's an excellent attempt, but as you heard from the comments, etc., I think the attempt is good. A lot of question about the actual model at work, but I hope, we all get engaged to try and answer. In Bangladesh, for example, the way forward, I saw the headline in the Daily Star on the day before yesterday, similar topic. And there, I think it's so important for us, economists in Bangladesh have been, in a way, conscience-driven. And in many periods of our nation's history, they really played a critical role. Sir is here, of course. In the 60s, in the 70s, etc. it is very important that because of our choice of analytical frameworks, we do not inadvertently slip into cheerleading for, for frameworks where the critical part, the Daily Star essentially said that there is growth despite governance. So governance, though that was not your intent actually at all, but that's how it was understood. So I think this is an issue, and I would say that this is a great entry point for economists to open up a whole world, but with due respectful attitude to the actual disciplines of political science and sociology. Thank you. Tea is outside.
Thank you all, sir. It was a very effective and knowledge-driven session. So we will move on to the crest presenting ceremony. So I would like to request Dr. Hossain Zillur Rahman to present the crest to Dr. Qazi Ali Tawfiq. To Ashikur Rahman. To Dr. Sabyasachi Kaur. To Dr. Mirza M. Hassan. To Dr. Selim Raihan. May I request Dr. Selim Raihan to present the crest to Dr. Hossain Zillur Rahman. That's what's called the tea. Thank you, sir. We will have a